Sister, Toon's perspective. My heart is racing and I feel my sprinting muscles tighten involuntarily as the call waits to be answered. I often have to explain to people that just because my species has the greatest resolution to our perception of time of any known sapient, it does not mean that I perceive the world in slow motion. The same way that when I maximize the frames in old footage, it doesn't cause it to run slower. Right now, however, this moment does seem to be stretching for an eternity. My apprehension is utterly overwhelming. I squeeze Victor's solid hand with two of mine, a squeeze that he returns gently enough not to fracture my metacarpals. The call is answered by a stunning, round-faced, freckled Levantine Neanderthal woman with long, straight hair. She looks at Victor and, with a broad grin, says, "Vicky, how's it going?" in a dialect of English which is identical to his. He smiles fondly back and answers, "Not too bad, T. Not too bad at all." She smirks, "I'll bet. Getting given honors by foreign planets must be nice. This is what? The seventh time that's happened?" He waves his hand in the negative sixth. She laughs, "Only 6 times. Wouldn't want you getting too big for your boots." Deploying an English idiom I've not come across, but am inferring to mean to become arrogant from context. She turns to Fluffy and, for 7.4 seconds, makes cooing noises in infant-directed speech. Fluffy yowls excitedly and paws at the screen. Finally, she turns her attention to me and, smiling warmly, asks Victor, "So, you gonna introduce me to your lady friend, Vicky?" Smiling just as warmly, Victor uses his right hand to gesture to me. "T, this is Toon Elf, my partner. Toon, this is Treg T Leaf, the closest thing I've got to a sister." She interrupts, seeming to be feigning woundedness. "You're saying you don't think of me as your precious big sister, Vicky." Victor smiles and rolls his eyes. "You're like 3 weeks older than me. We'd be twins, surely, if we was going to be siblings." She closes her eyes, turns her face up and to her left, and answers, "3 weeks is 3 weeks, Vicky. I'm your big sis, and you've got to listen to me." Yeah, answers Victor. It's very clear this is not the first time they've run through exactly this tongue-in-cheek dispute. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Leaf," I proffer nervously. She bursts into raucous laughter, and I'm momentarily terrified into thinking that I've already made a fool of myself, despite only having spoken 8 words to her. She says, "You can call me Treg, sweetheart, or T if you like. I'm only Dr. Leaf to folk I meet in my clinic. Can I call you Toon, or would you prefer Elf?" Toon is fine. I'd prefer that Treg," I say anxiously. She turns to address Victor. "Your girlfriend's a real cutie. Might have to hop a transport out and steal her away from you." "You've already got your own cutie. Hands off," he jokes, shielding me with his arms. Smugly, she answers, "One can never have enough cuties." Victor sighs and to me says, "She ain't actually poly, by the way, Toon. She just likes teasing about it." "I ain't poly to your knowledge, Vicky. You can't assume I'm monogamous just because I've only got one husband so far," she grins. "And the reason you'd have kept it from me for 30 years, if you were—" he asks, turning to her with a sardonically raised eyebrow. She grins, causing me to notice that, while her face is much more sapien-soid-looking than Thran's, her teeth look every bit as Neanderthaloid. "Simple," she answers. "Whether I'm poly or not, you not knowing is much more fun." He shakes his head exasperatedly. I have a question," I say tentatively. "Why does Victor call you T if you've known each other since childhood?" She smiles. "That's 'cause Vicky was the first one to call me T, was very pleased with himself for figuring out that the name I chose for myself abbreviates to T. Leaf, and I love myself some hot leaf juice. In fairness, T, it ain't like you figured that out," teases Victor. "Yeah, probably would have chosen a different name if I had, wouldn't I?" She shoots back before continuing. "When I went to King's, I told all my friends to call me T. So, by the time they had to give me an epithet, they'd almost forgotten that T weren't actually my name. Till I reminded him, that is." Here, Victor asks, "Lloyd and Chelsea going to be joining us, T?" "Chelsea's not. Lloyd's just on his way back from taking her to his sister's in Clonbarris, where she's going to get spoiled rotten all weekend. He should have already been back, but he said he had a bit of trouble hailing a capsule. Almost told you to hold off on calling, but figured I'd just talk to you till he gets back." She shrugs. Victor gives a nod of fair enough. "Lloyd's your husband, Treg? Chelsea's your daughter?" I ask. She smiles and nods. "2 for 2. You go, girlfriend, and then I'd have liked to introduce you to Chelsea, but, well, hell hath no fury, like Rhiannon Fire." Morgan denied time with her niece. She then leans forward and narrows her eyes. "I have to say, I'm impressed you've managed not to ask about my eyes and hair for this long." "What's she talking about? What should I be asking about her eyes and hair?" "Her hair's straight, which is quite unusual for a Neanderthal, but not massively. Not so much that it would be a burning question in anyone's mind. But what else could it be?" She leans back and studies the highly confused expression I'm sure I'm wearing. Victor tells me you were raised on a Terran world. You're not at all curious about whether a girl with carmine hair and lime green eyes had them modded that way? Victor explains before I can. She can't see those colors, T. I have total monochromacy. I add, my cradle world is an eyeball world, so there wasn't enough light to discern color in my species' evolutionary history. Really? She asks, addressing me while leaning forward with a fascinated expression on her face. I nod nervously. And if you don't mind my asking, what's with the glowing eyes? T? Chides Victor crossly. I put my right hands on his left shoulder and say, Victor, it's fine. I'm not offended. I don't mind answering. He looks at me for a few moments before seeming to be satisfied that I'm truly not upset. I turn back to Treg's freckled face, waiting expectantly for me to account for arguably the most strikingly non-Terran feature of my appearance. I start, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I've heard from some of the Dawn exiles on Nova Fenniscandia that our eyes glow for non-verbal communication while stalking prey in our evolutionary past. They let us do things like signal where we were in relation to the prey, which way we were facing, the animal we're intending to go after, etc. She nods, engrossed. And what about the animals you were hunting? Could they not have used your eyes to spot you? They could, I respond. But bioluminescence is quite common among Donalan fauna and flora, so it wasn't as much of a disadvantage to stealth as you'd think. The advantages of silent communication in the dark must have outweighed any disadvantage to stealth, if that is the mechanism by which my species gained our glowing eyes. And she scoots forward in her seat, fixing me with an intent expression. Why is bioluminescence so common on your cradle? I shrug. I'm afraid I don't know about that. I didn't grow up there. There, unfortunately, wasn't a Dawn school teacher or biology specialist among those of us marooned in Terran space. She seems here to realize that she's accidentally steered me into a sensitive area, and she says, Oh, I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to pry. I was just curious. It's okay, Treg. Like I said, I was happy to answer. I smile. Well, even so, she starts before trailing off. Have you seen Maya recently, T? Says Victor, with the force of someone intentionally changing the subject. She nods with a crooked smile. Yeah, saw her a few weeks ago. We had tea. Well, I had tea. She simulated having tea. It was nice, but, well, you know Maya. She's always viewed child rearing as more science than art. It's clear she ain't actually that bothered about seeing me. I don't know about that, challenges Victor. Don't the fact that she agreed to meet mean that she wanted to meet? Like, even if she only agreed for your sake, and not 'cause she'd get anything out of seeing you, isn't that its own kind of love? Like, if she's seeing you 'cause she don't want you to get upset by her refusing, that means she cares about upsetting you, don't it? She nods, concedingly. I never said she didn't love us, in her own way. Just that her ways of loving and caring are a bit clinical. Clinical? Queries Victor. Yeah, you remember the nutrition schedule she had us on growing up? Answers Treg. Yep. What about him? I reckon being on those schedules is why we're both close to as tall as we can be without getting gene therapy. Also got me fantastically predisposed to the habits needed to maintain peak physical fitness. I said it was clinical. I didn't say it didn't work. It worked brilliantly for you, at least. I gained 20 kilograms as soon as I was at uni and making my own food choices. With a wry smirk, Victor counters, Oh, I'm sure the weight you gained at uni had everything to do with the nutrition schedules you'd been on up to that point, and nothing at all to do with the fact that, beginning of second year, you started dating a baker, who, by your account, is also a fantastic cook more generally. Then moved in with him, then married him. It must be the lack of self-control you had from always being prescribed what to eat, and not the unlimited supply of snacky treats. That's, she starts, but then cuts herself off, looking away from us. Speak of the devil. She switches the camera to her hollow, stands and walks to a pair of clear doors, leading out onto a lush balcony garden, beyond which is a breathtaking view of the London skyline, from what looks like well over a kilometer up. The city is a sparse forest of sky piercers, one of which Treg presumably lives in, covered in the profuse foliage of balcony gardens and parks, and towering over the much lower buildings filling the spaces between them. I have never seen such a populous city as London looks to be. The largest city on Fennoscandia only has about 7 million people, and while I have visited larger cities since I left, London has easily x10 that many. At least, that's what it looks like. A small transport capsule is approaching Treg's balcony at a decent clip. As it draws close, The capsule wheels to the side and drifts to the safety railing, deploying a ramp over it once it is drawn level. Down the ramp comes a slender sapiens with pale skin, short dark hair, and a friendly smile displayed across his soft-featured face. "Look who it is!" He beams with a bouncing melodic cadence, in an accent that I'm taking to be Welsh. "How are you doing, champ?" He continues with feigned awkwardness. "I am doing well." "How are you doing, sport?" responds Victor, matching the pretense of uneasiness. Seeing me looking at him confused in his periphery, Victor turns and explains, as the other two make their way back to the sofa. "That's a little in-joke Lloyd and I have, Toon. The first time T introduced me to him on a holochat, we talked for a bit, but then she went to the loo and left us alone. Long moment of silence. Then he goes, so... And it was so awkward that I burst out laughing. Then he burst out laughing. Since then, pretending to be super uncomfortable with each other's been our thing," with a chuckle. I nod my understanding. It's nice that Victor's been able to form an in-joke with a man he's never met in person. "Right so. Does one of you two want to introduce me to the Dwadi next to Victor, and then she can tell us all about herself? Then I'd like Victor to tell me what's been occurring on the latest episodes of my favorite soap. Victor on the bright plume." "I have brought popcorn," grins the jocular man, producing an empty cardboard container and a bag of popcorn, and showing them to his wife, causing her chest to bounce up and down in mirth. Victor introduces me, and then I tell them a little about myself. I don't go into quite as much depth as I did in my interview last year, but I'm sure they're not having much trouble filling in the gaps. I'm asked a few embarrassing questions, such as what exactly I find attractive about Victor, but mostly we just have a pleasant chat. After the couple and I have been suitably acquainted, Victor is prompted to recount the latest happenings aboard the ship, which he does animatedly, as Treg and Lloyd snack on the popcorn that Lloyd brought. "You're joking," reacts Treg, popcorn frozen halfway to her mouth. "Nope," negates Victor. "Mage ended things with the Shings and immediately got engaged to Felicity." "His ex? The Fullies? The one that hates him? The one who's always chopsing him?" inquires Lloyd incredulously. Victor shrugs. "Apparently she didn't hate him so much as we thought. Complete attitude shift since then. She won't stop clinging to him now. I don't think I'd ever heard a Felis purr before recently." "That's wild. People are complicated," opines Treg, rubbing her temples as if the strain of processing what she's been told is causing her a mild headache. "How are the Shings taking it?" "They don't seem distraught. I've seen them a few times since. When Noah was fixing my shattered ulna the other day, I asked her about it and how she was doing, how Nan was doing. She basically said that they always knew it weren't going to last forever, and while she wouldn't have chosen to end it so soon, she's not upset that it ended. Very emotionally mature," says Victor. "I don't like how casual you are about broken bones, Victor," says his sort of sister. "You'd get a stern talking to if you kept coming back to my clinic with breaks." Victor gives an apologetic shrug. "Breaks sorta ain't avoidable with the training I'm doing, T." Treg looks as if she's about to say more before her husband interrupts. "Sorry to say, but we've got plans, so we've got to go now in a minute. It was bloody tidy to meet you, Toon." "Yes, a pleasure. Perhaps next time we see you on a call will be before Vicky's therapist sets it for him as homework again," smirks Treg, causing Victor to look abashed. "I very much enjoyed meeting you two, too. Likewise, I hope to see you again soon." I smile back. We all wave our goodbyes and the call ends. Victor turns his holopad to me. "Could you just confirm that that is an ended call for me?" I look. "It is an ended call, Victor," I say with a wry, upward curl of my mouth. "Are you making fun of me? It wasn't you who didn't end the call last time?" He shakes his head emphatically. "Nope, not making fun. The fact that it was you last time don't mean it can't be me this time." I smile warmly at the man of my dreams and the love of my life before leaning over the arms of our chairs and planting a kiss on the side of his face, his cheek warm beneath my lips. "You're too kind, Victor. I don't like it," I tease. He gives a mirthful exhale and looks down. "So," I prompt, "are you ready to show me the other part of your therapy homework, Victor?" He turns his face toward me, pressing his forehead to mine. "If you're sure you're ready, Toon, I'm ready." "Victor, I'm absolutely ready, but, well, didn't you tell me that Alkinad said that you oughtn't to push yourself? Might introducing me to Treg and Lloyd be enough for this week?" He nods. "She did at first only suggest introducing you. This part was my idea. I just don't want you feeling like it's a part of my life you ain't welcome in, Toon. I want you to know that you're welcome anytime you're ready. Though, obviously, if you ain't ready." "I'm ready," I interrupt with finality. He searches my eyes for 7/12ths of a second before nodding and getting up. He makes his way to our bed where, at some point during the call, Fluffy settled up against the headboard. He reclines against her side in a sitting position. I follow and lie against him, such that he can see over my shoulder, He reaches around me with his two bulky arms and knots them across my stomach. I would have liked to offer to be the big spoon for him, but given his density and overall weight, that's an offer I couldn't make good on, as discomfort would leave the time I could tolerate being crushed unacceptably low. I settle for placing my lower hands on the tops of his thighs and my uppers against his external obliques. Before we start, do you want to wear your translator? Most of it's in a pretty thick Lallans. You might have trouble. I think for a moment, looking across the room to where I left my translator on the desk, and wonder if it's worth getting up from my comfortable position. I'll try it without, maybe I won't need it, I decide. All right, let me know if you change your mind. Ready? He asks. I nod. Hollow, place saved video file 1 to the far wall, he instructs. The wall is immediately adorned with the likeness of two sitting humans, both of whom were dead years before I was born. The slim woman has pale skin, a soft-featured face, which makes her look a lot like Victor, the most voluminous head of long curly hair I've ever seen on any creature, and wears the subtlest of smiles, bereft of any joy. The man is tall and bulky looking with dark hair, dark eyes, and a sheer, angular face, wearing an expression that looks like irritation or disgust, but, upon closer inspection, may just be neutral for him. His arms are folded defensively across his front. I'm struck by just how young they both look. It does make sense. They were half a decade younger than I am now, but still, the thought of having to record something like this when you're scarcely more than a child. The dazzlingly beautiful woman raises her hand in a brief greeting gesture and speaks somberly to camera. Hey, Victor, my name's Purst Esme Reed, and I'm your ma. She gestures to the dark-haired man. This is Puffed Oscar Taylor, your and these, right here, she gestures to her stomach. Des is ye. If you're seeing these, Victor, it means that we didn't make it, but ye did. You're still alive, and you're old enough to ken what you're looking at. What I'm saying to ye, know these, Victor. I haven't ye seen your face yet, and I already love ye more than life itself. I didn't want anything mair than to be there, to see your first steps, the first time you lose a tooth, the first time you get in a rammy at shul, the first time you bring hame a lassie, or maybe a laddie, or maybe you'd have telled us you're no interested in aether. I wish I could cry as I watch ye gae off to uni. I want that mair than I wish my man could have deigned that for me. Though I can't before, what we were gonna be fighting for. I didn't, but I day now. We're not gonna be fighting say we can come back to a world where we can live the rest of our lives. We're gonna be fighting to make a world where you can grow up safe. And, well, as you're seeing this, it looks like we succeeded, and that we didn't make it to be there with you. I'm say sorry we couldn't be there for you. Couldn't be a mither and father for you. And I can these vid diaries is nae a substitute for that. But it's the best we hae the offer. I wish we had mair to gie ye, Victor. I'm sorry, Victor. Could you pause? He pauses and asks, what's wrong? Do you need your translator after all? No, it's not that. I sniffle. I'm just having a little trouble seeing. My watery eyes are refracting the luminescence of my own irides back into my pupils, turning the footage into a blinding light show. Repeal. Apprehensively, I squeeze my perch with both my natural and bionic talons. Korak is beside me and, like me, leant forward in anticipation. Most of my crew are gathered here in the canteen, but the room is entirely silent. You could hear a pip drop. The attention of all is at the wall, on which is projected live footage from Citadel, the only lag being one of about 30 seconds from real time, artificially added to allow time for the feed to be cut if something horrible were to happen. No prizes for guessing which species first had that idea. The scarlet-skinned man standing atop the podium on screen is extremely large, even for a Vingerian, easily more than 5 millimeters to the top of his shoulder hump and nearly 6 millimeters to the top of his conical horn. If a sapient that large, or in danger of becoming so, anytime in the near future, were to apply for employment on my ship, I would need to gently point out that they might find navigating some of the spaces aboard to be something of a challenge. Though knuckle-walkers, his species do not use their long forelimbs for anything but the crudest manipulation, instead using a set of 9 prehensile tendrils at the end of their snouts around their mouths. The speaker turns his head to get a better look at the information in front of him, with the 2 eyes on the left side of his head, his beard of tendrils flopping limply as he does so, and in a low, rumbling voice, reminiscent of the call of Quorat birds, or the songs of Terran whales, which, by necessity, must be slow to account for how long it takes to say anything with his resonance chamber, says, with, tween, three, votes the eyes have had the tune pass habs. We don't get to hear how many abstentions or nays there were as the canteen erupts into thundering roars and jubilant cheers. A banner is unfurled bearing the words, "Congratulations, Twila," written out in English, and "Happy Twila," written out in Galactic Standard, which has no word for congratulate, nor any way to denote an exclamation. Party poppers are detonated, hurling streamers everywhere. The footage cuts to reactions from the various delegations from around the amphitheatrical Parliament building. The Rathij delegate, positioned in the aquatic section beneath the main podium, is shown curling and uncurling all 12 of his tentacles in joy. The Lennoxer delegate pounds the table with her break-eating hands and repeatedly inflates her gular sac for great, resounding hoots. The Wam dances from one of her hand feet, located at the end of her two limbs, to the other. The delegate from Shoandu raises her trunk in the dignified salute. The Terran is shown giving a warm smile, his lips closed, as he looks out at the podium. The celebratory din quiets enough for me to make out the restatement of the motion that just passed, mercifully given by the Ziv Scully deputy speaker, rather than the slow-speaking speaker. Citive immediately. Artificial intelligences that have been produced using the Berlin method are to be considered full citizens of the Galactic Union and to be afforded the self-same rights as biological sapient beings. Amnesty is granted to any intelligences constructed before this law was repealed, who may now, a hermaphroditic, radially symmetrical heptapedal species, with an upturned mouth and no vocal cords, the Sk communicate by facing their 12 manipular eye stalks toward the one they wish to talk to and blinking out a message. Curiously, I look to the new addition, the linguist. She's looking at their eyes, and hers are darting intently back and forth. Of course, she would comprehend a language that she's 10 eyes short of the ability to converse in. She is a Terran linguist, after all, and the galaxy's finest at that. Twila has multiplied her holographic avatar to make a throng of a few dozen incorporeal Terran girls, all doing different celebratory dances. Emiko is sat with her bodyguard and Zahn. They are raising a toast with 3 champagne flutes, which looks so delicate I'm surprised Miss Hunter is even able to hold hers without shattering it. Victor and Toon are grinning, 3 of their fists in the air, and animatedly beating their respective chests with the other 3. Dr. Mink is clinging to Mazia's side, the 2 of them sharing a kiss to mark this historic moment. Her ring, with gems cut in such a way as to create a facsimile of fire, is visible on the IV digit of her left paw hand. I've still got mild emotional whiplash from the Fellis doctor going from seeming to despise him to the 2 of them announcing that not only were they back together, they were engaged. Some of the crew present who are less familiar with Terrans are looking around at the joyous reveling of the Bio-Terrans with puzzled expressions that suggest they believe these to be quite over-the-top reactions for the repeal of a law that had no direct effect on them. Clearly, they have never been taught what words like community, solidarity, and family mean to Terrans. Later, the party is wound down. My mate went to roost some time ago, taking our daughter to her incubator. Hasyak and Krish are having a murmured conversation on the other side of the room, her coiling herself around him tenderly. They're the last of the triple M's present. So, Twila, what does it feel? I smile at her holographic form. It feels amazing. I'm so glad. I feel uniquely privileged to have woken up just in time to see the repeal of a 900,000-year-old law banning my kind from existing. I nod appreciatively. I can only imagine. I think the closest precedent must be the peace. Not that I think anyone ever bothered to pass a law prohibiting the existence of Deathworlders. She giggles. I think when a coalition of nearly 34,000 species declares war on Deathworlders, you can assume that they consider Deathworlderhood illegal by default. True enough, I laugh. After a brief pause, I change the subject, asking, is there anything I ought to be aware of that results from you being a citizen now? She shrugs. A few things. As I'm no longer legally your property, it puts your ability to sell the bright plume into a slight legal gray area, for instance. I balk. You weren't my property, Twila. She smiles. I get that that's not how you saw it, but on paper, I was legally software and you owned the hardware that hosted me, meaning that you owned me as well. GU law previously made no allowance for the autonomy of AIs, since our existence has only been permitted for a few hours. On paper, you owned me. I consider in horror the fact that I owned a person until a few hours ago and didn't even fucking realize it. I'm so sorry, Twyla. I didn't. It's fine, Captain. Honestly, I consider it a stunning reflection on your character that your first reaction there was disgust at the thought of having owned me, and not anger at the compromise of your ship's resale value. I give a flick of my crown plumes and an irritated flap as I say, I don't plan to sell the bright plume anytime soon. If I ever do, I assume it will be as simple as having a little chat with you about whether you would prefer to stay on or be provided with alternate hardware to inhabit. Realizing that I owned a person trumps that. She grins. Yeah, you can treat me like any other employee in that regard. After you settle 16 and a half years back pay, that is. I blanch and frantically begin doing sums. I may need to, I may need to work out a payment plan with you, Twyla. She gives a great cackling laugh. Captain, ha 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 ha, the look on your face. Ha 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 ha, that was priceless. After having calmed down from her laughing fit, she explains, you don't owe me any back pay, Captain. Most of that time, I wouldn't even have qualified as sentient under Terran law. I would have been classed as a proto-sentient, capable of becoming sentient, but not yet sentient. I technically haven't been your employee since I woke up either, as I wasn't a citizen. I'm still not a citizen for the moment. I keep checking the registration site, but it's crashed from the volume of AIs trying to declare themselves. I nod consideringly for a little while before saying, Twyla, I want you to let me know the moment you're registered. I have a job to offer you. She raises an eyebrow. Would this job potentially be something like shipboard manager? Might it possibly include such responsibilities as life support monitoring, engine monitoring, subliminal and superluminal navigation? I chitter, indeed it would. I can throw in a meaningless title like executive shipboard manager, if that would sweeten the deal. She puffs, mirthfully. That's quite all right, Captain. I think the job will already be attractive enough. It will be nice to be able to start receiving a salary, though. The body that Jenny's building me needs a few components that are a little out of her price range. She's really only able to work on it as a hobby project. Now, I can sponsor her. Really, Gato told me she designed my leg in less than an hour? I say, holding up my bionic. She nods. Yeah, your leg doesn't require a brain. It only needs to be intelligent enough to give sensory feedback and perform motor function impulses. A physical avatar would need to be able to sustain my intelligence. Jenny's good, but no one's that good. That's why the UTC didn't build a droid army during the war. It would have been an inefficient waste of high-level manufacturing capacity. I consider that for a while. At this point, I realize how tired I am and say, all right, Twyla, it's been lovely talking to you, but I need to go to roost now. Congratulations again. She beams, good night, Captain. Rest well. We'll be arriving at Nova Fennoscandia tomorrow morning. And Captain? I turn yes, Twyla. She hesitates a few moments before saying, I just want to tell you that of all the people whose ship I might have woken up as, I'm glad it was you. Cold, Victor's perspective. There it is. Through the shuttle window is a large, rocky planet with a ring system, from two of its moons having been torn apart by its gravity when they crossed its rush limit, 145 and another 20 million years ago. I feel a nauseating swoop in my stomach, as if the grav plating had been turned off. I reflect on the ridiculous way the women I'm about to meet for the first time, in the flesh at least, have me more scared than I was when I fought those pirates, or in that brief moment when I first met Fluffy, where I thought she was about to try and eat me. Toon clearly senses my nerves as she puts two of her arms around my shoulders and bends to give a tender kiss, her lips cool against my cheek. Toon's perspective, as the shuttle passes the inner of my home planet's rings, Vanaheimr, I'm able to make out the shape of my home continent, near Nordlands. We draw closer, and the snow-capped mountains resolve themselves from the muddy green valleys. We're headed for the southwest coast. We get close enough for me to make out the shape of a very familiar building, perched above the tree line. But below the snow line, on a mountain overlooking the sea, is an enormous langoose. The ground floor, I know, is a single open plan room, which serves as a mead hall, meeting place and religious space to the local Fornsitter community, as well as a skaldic recital space. Above the mead hall, however, is a home, the home where I lived from 6 to 21. The shuttle sets down and the door opens. Hasyek's perspective. Cold. This planet is freezing. Literally. I think those mountains are covered in a layer of solid water. Having been brought up on Prisnith and only visiting my cradle world, Sahak, 3 times growing up, I'm obviously used to the general ambient temperature being somewhat below ideal for me, but it's never been like this. I assume that Terrans had more or less the same temperature range as Sahas. The last Terran planet was a tiny bit cooler than I set the thermostat for myself. The one before it was just about perfect, Well, the inhabited parts were. Don't think I'd like to have tried my luck in that equatorial desert band. This planet is so cold that I can feel my muscles seize up as the stone of the path robs them of their heat. Chris. I say, only noticing at this point that my mind has slowed down along with my body. I can't speak properly. The warm Terran, swaddled in an enormous coat, turns to me, a concerned look on his face. What is it, Asi? It's cold, I say, hearing the sluggishness of my words, but powerless to stop it. His eyes widen in horror. You didn't bring a climate field? I shake my head from side to side in his people's gesture of no, easier than saying the word right now. Why not? Toon told us her planet was cold, he asks, aghast. Didn't be bad, trying and failing to articulate. Shit! Hasi! He says, pressing his wonderfully warm body against mine before turning his head to shout, Victor! I need some help here! Heidi's perspective. I'm just seeing to all the place settings in my wife's mead hall ahead of tonight's party when I hear a frantic bang, bang, bang coming from the door facing downhill toward the landing pad. A little alarmed by the urgency in that knock, I hurry to the door and pull it open. There stands a recognizable, copper-haired boy, almost as tall as my wife, though rather stouter for the missing few centimeters. Over his shoulders, the lolling, half-conscious head of a rough-worlder. But this girl is not my daughter. This scarlet-scaled girl sibilantly burbling through the scarf, gagging her fang-filled mouth, presumably to stop herself envenoming in her addle-pated state, with her arms, ending in two-thumbed hands, hung limply over his shoulders, is Asahi's. This must be Haesiak. Behind them is a slim South Asian-looking boy, carrying the woman's tail, seemingly more to keep it from trailing on the ground than to help with bearing her weight. This must be Krish. Behind him is my daughter. Sorry, ma'am, no time for pleasantries, says Toon's boyfriend, barging past me, and not seeming to notice having reverted to calling me ma'am. You got a place where an ectotherm can warm up? He asks, having already thoroughly assessed the situation before he spoke. I simply say, follow me, and do a small jog to get ahead of him. I lead them through the long tables to a fireplace stacked with wood. It wasn't intended to be lit for a few more hours, but needs must. I take a lighter from its hiding place and set it to the kindling. My wife being an excellent fire builder, the hearth will be roaring in nearly no time at all. I turn to the boys, set her down on the mat, try not to let her touch the stone of the floor. Krish, I presume. He nods, worry still twisting his features. How about you prop her up against yourself, Krish? That way, not only will she have the fire's heat, warming her up from the front, and yours from behind, but you can also make sure she's not getting burned. Good thinking, he says, bending to pull his half-conscious girlfriend against himself, to share his heat with her. Katrin's perspective. There he is, the man my youngest daughter has chosen for her own, sitting apart from the others in my home. I stride up to him, clap him heartily on the back, and say, Victor! Good to finally meet you in the flesh. Distractedly, he turns to me then, realizing who is hailing him, starts and stands up. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Katrin, he says awkwardly. Likewise, son. I smirk back before cocking an eyebrow and asking, Are you going to tell me what the long face is for? Embarrassed, he looks away. I'm just nervous, is all. Kid, I know what someone beating themselves up looks like. You want to talk about it? His face tells me he does, but that he doesn't wish to say that he does. Tell me what's up. I assume it's got something to do with the state that your friend came in, I say, sitting down across from where he was sat. He sighs the sigh I've heard at some point from every child I've raised, sits and says, Yeah, I guess I'm just kicking myself because it's my job to take care of things, like it does everyone have a climate field who needs one. I must have made a terrible impression on you and your wife, showing up with a woman unconscious cause of my negligence. I don't suppose it would make a difference if I pointed out that you're on leave? He puffs and shakes his head. I don't suppose it would make a difference if I pointed out that your friend is fine. Another shake and a mirthless smile. Nope. What about if I point out that a climate field probably wouldn't have made a difference? He's immediately intrigued. It wouldn't have? I don't think so, I respond. The landing pad's only a few hundred meters away down the hill. I don't think she can possibly have lost enough heat, just to the air, to put her into torpor. It will have been the heat she was loosing to the ground that will have been the lion's share. And that's quite a lot of abstracting to do. It would need to occur to you that, unlike a humanoid, she needs most of her body in contact with the ground to move, that she would dislike clothing coming between her and the ground, that the ground will be cold, and that conduction is the most efficient means of heat transfer. Then you would have had to convince her to take some countermeasure, like allowing herself to be carried or putting an insulating layer on around her thorax. And let me tell you, as a woman who's raised 13 kids, There is nothing so stubborn as a child who's just been told to put on a layer. He laughs. That does actually make me feel a little better. Though Hasyuk is a grown woman. I wouldn't have imagined you being the type to argue with your kids about their layering. Oh, I definitely wasn't. How dare you accuse me of being responsible? I wink. If it had been up to me, we would have warned every child once that they were improperly dressed, then let the cold teach them their lesson. My wife, on the other hand, true to her epithet, has the ferocity of a Valkyrie. She would always insist. He frowns. I thought your wife was a Christian. How'd she end up with the epithet Valkyrie? I interrupt. Simple. I gave it to her. You met at uni? He asks, astonished. We did, I confirm. She was a second year. I was in my first, despite being a few years older than her, since I did a term in the military first. This year marks our 118th year together and our 112th year of marriage. Wow, you two are really in it for the long haul, he exclaims, clearly impressed. I smile. We are. In fact, we already grew old in each other's arms. I don't imagine I'd ever want to be with a woman who was not sat by my hospital bed as I lay dying of old age. He grins and spends a few seconds clearly daydreaming. Is it you thinking about spending 100 years with my daughter that's put that dopey grin on your face? I smirk. His face falls and he makes an embarrassed expression. Listen, Victor, I say, putting as much sincerity as I can muster into my words. I can tell that you're very serious about my daughter, and I could not be happier about that. Just bear in mind, not every couple is one that can or should stay together for a century. His face here looks appalled, and he looks like he's about to try and interrupt. I'm not saying that you and Toon aren't destined for the long haul. I reassure him. I'm just saying that you ought to give it time. Don't rush into anything. Heidi and I waited 6 years to get married because we realized that how we felt about each other then might not be how we would always feel. He considers that for a few moments, then answers, I understand, ma'am. I nod approvingly and change the subject. Would you like to hear the story of how Heidi and I met? It's also the story of why I called her Valkyrie. Before he has a chance to answer, the Valkyrie herself appears, saying, Darling, you'll bore the poor boy to death with your stories, before turning to address him, smiling, Victor, please don't feel any obligation to let this old hag put you to sleep. No, I'm actually really interested, he assures her. I smirk at my wife, pat the seat beside me, and say, You are welcome to help me tell it. If you think I'm a bad scald. She rolls her eyes and explains to Victor, My wife is very fond of reminding me that while she's managed to convince all but 4 of the children we've raised to accept her faith, I've only managed to convince 1, as if the Gospels could compete with elves, dwarves, Jotnar, and magic hammers. Your book has a talking snake, a talking donkey, children getting mauled to death by bears for calling a man bald, seas getting parted. It's a poor scald who blames her stories. She laughs and shakes her head, then turns to Victor. You should have seen the looks on her parents' faces when I told them I was a Christian. It was as though they thought I was about to jump onto the table and scream Deus lo volt at the top of my lungs while chopping their heads off, or declare that they were heretics and needed to be burned at the stake. In fairness to them, dear, you did do all of those things, I say, making the same tease I must have made literally over 1,000 times. She turns to look up at me, her lips pursed and twisted in mock irritation. And the same way she must have done literally over 1,000 times, answers, In fairness to me, darling, I never did any of them. People calling themselves Christians might have, but the God I pray to is one who loves all of his children, more than he wants all of them to go to the right church every Sunday. Holding me responsible for the actions of crusaders and witch hunters makes as much sense as blaming you for the sack of Lindisfarne. I grin if you say so, my Valkyrie, giving her a squeeze. She sighs, turns to the boy, and dispassionately says, She originally called me Valkyrie because, while we went to Akureyri together, she was reenacting a longboat landing and I was volunteering as a first aider. I was up on a hill on a land speeder to be out of the way. This idiot, she thumbs at me, got herself cut by a sword that some other idiot had accidentally swapped for their blunt reenacting model. As she lay in the sand, dying, I was lowering down over top of her, and because she had tunnel vision and was addled from blood loss, she thought I was a Valkyrie coming to take her either to Valhall or Folkvanger. Sweetheart, I bellow incredulously, if you tell it like that, any story will be boring. Where's the buildup? The fact that you recognize me from having seen me around uni? The fact that the girl you were with was too busy trying to flirt with you to notice something not being right? The fact that you barked orders at a host of armed and armored people, and they obeyed you like you were the most frightening thing they had ever seen? The fact that you rode in the ambulance with me? And how could you leave out our first wager? First wager, says Victor curiously. I nod and gesture for my wife to tell him. She gives a fond sigh and says, "This one wakes up." Massive great gash along the side of her chest. She gestures to where my scar is and blearily asks me if she's dead or not. I tell her she's dead stupid, but her heart is still beating, though. I can't say how much longer that will last. She grins and says, she gestures to me. I do the same grin I did on that day, as best as I remember, and say, "I'll wager you a date that I live." Feast, in Miko's perspective. The tallest sapiens I've ever seen, man or woman, stands, raises a horn and prays, "Hail to you, day! Hail the day's sons! Hail night and her kinswoman! Look upon us here with loving eyes, and send us victory! Hail to you, gods! Hail to you, goddesses! Hail to the generous earth! Give to us eloquent words, wisdom, and healing hands in all this life," before bringing the horn to her lips and drinking deeply of the mead, mirrored by almost everyone in the room, the only exceptions being the garden worlders, for whom this drink would be quite poisonous, and the singular Muslim, all of whom have horns presumably full of something besides mead. The mead is both surprisingly flat, given how fizzy it was when it was poured for me, and surprisingly dry. I definitely expected honey wine to taste sweeter. But then I suppose wine doesn't taste that much like grapes, does it? Her prayer come toast completed, the straw-blonde woman looks down, from her raised platform at the head of the room, to the other 4 long tables filled with around 1,500 locals, a few dozen bright plumers who accepted Toon's invitation, and piled with food, mostly of the roasted and meaty varieties. "Now," booms the mountainous blonde, looking around at all present, "it will not escape the notice of any of you that Odin has not withheld wit from, but we are visited by many guests from off-world tonight. I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone in this room that compared to us, garden worlders are very fragile. Please do not be as physical with them as you are with each other. They're liable to get hurt. Additionally, if I hear that any of you, my brothers and sisters in Thor, have made any of our guests feel in any way unwelcome, you'll answer to me." There's an uncomfortable shift that goes around the room at the imposing woman's words. I think I understand what she meant when she told us earlier that they hadn't elected her as their priestess just because she was the strongest, oldest, or the only one of them who lived in her own mead hall. She allows the threat to sit a moment before a smile breaks over her face, and she quips, "And if I think you really need to be taught a lesson, I'll pass you off to my wife," smirking and gesturing to the much smaller and daintier woman sitting to her left, who smiles and rolls her eyes as the room erupts into a raucous laugh. She lets the laughter mostly die down before she holds up her hand and silence falls, allowing her to continue. She gestures to Toon, sitting to her right. "I'm sure you've all noticed that my Toonie is back with us." That's met with a cheer. Yes, not for long, I'm afraid, but tonight she will be narrating the story of Thor's wedding. She's also brought her partner, Victor. Give us a wave, Victor. The copper-haired man raises his hand and gives a small wave, and the priestess turns back to her congregation, wryly saying, "Try not to be too jealous of either of them, ladies, gents, and others." This is met by a hearty chuckle from everyone. After the performance of Thor's wedding, Victor is going to give a recitation of the first part of Beowulf, Beowulf's fight against Grendel. There are some considering noises at that. But first, she says with a conclusive tone, "We must eat, we must drink, and we must be merry." A cheer goes up, and the Norsemen and Norsewomen begin helping themselves to the food, with the rest of us following their lead. Zahn's perspective. Me, Emiko, and Thran have been eating for a few minutes when a short and extremely stout and stocky man, who looks to be 3/4 Neanderthal, 1/4 Sapiens, approaches the table from my left. He has a thick beard, which, I would guess, he thinks disguises the extent to which his muzzle protrudes, Homer Simpson style. His long hair is plaited into a braid that reaches most of the way to his arse, though it must go well past there when unbraided. Both his hair and beard are a rich reddish-brown burgundy color. His skin is slightly darker than Thran's, and his eyes slightly lighter. He jabs a girthy gloved finger at Thrain, and in a voice so fried as to suggest that he has spent all day, and many prior days, screaming at the top of his lungs, says, "I know you." I see Thran's face fall, almost imperceptibly. She begins, "Yes, I'm Thrangi. Triple thickness." The man cuts her off. "Silver-plated, dyed aquamarine accents and royal blue gauntlets. Open-faced helm. Matching plasma, Bec de Corbin. Am I right?" he declares with the triumphant tone of someone who knows he's not wrong. "How do you know what my girlfriend's armor looks like, sir?" I ask, my tone perfectly level. He wheels on me, a slightly manic grin on his face. "Because I'm the one that forged it," he says gleefully, gesturing at the empty space beside me and saying, I've got a story. If you fine ladies have a space for me. I look to Thran and Emiko, both of them looking curious. I smile. I think we have a space. Tell us your story, mister. Grasping my hand with his thick, sinewy one, and almost pulling me off the bench with the enthusiasm of the sheikh, he answers, Sindrasun, Broker Clang, Sindrasun. Loper, I reply. Lieutenant Zahn Longstride Loper. Emiko smiles. Miyazaki, smiles Emiko. Thran Gimli Hunter, mutters Thran, awkwardly fixing him with an unblinking stare. Not seeming to even notice Thran's social ineptness, the jocular man launches into his story, speaking as much with his gesticulative hands as with his mouth. So, 35 years ago in Reykjavik, the UTC lost in me what I'm sure would have been a thoroughly mediocre and unremarkable soldier when a recruitment officer heard that I was most of the way through an apprenticeship at my father's Durasteel foundry and marked me exempt from service, gaining instead an exceptional smith. My skills were forged in the fires of the war, as there was suddenly a need for Durasteel in quantities never dreamt before. A need for practical solutions to issues you only discover once you've taken your armor to battle. That war made me better at forging Durasteel than just about anyone else, I reckon. He speaks with refreshing pride. I sort of wish everyone could have this man's self-confidence. Jumping ahead to about 2 years ago, I get a call from a friend and colleague I met during the war. Lives on Nova Italia these days. He says to me, Broker, I've had a commission come in that I think is beyond my skill level. Are you interested? Now, I'm always up for a challenge, so I say, sure. Send me the measurements and the outline of the job, and I'll have a look. The details come through, and I read them, and am instantly pissed off. I say to him, Fabrizio, I don't do showpieces. My armor is meant to be worn, is meant to protect people, not to sit around gathering dust in some rich arsehole's hallway. He gives me a smile and tells me it's not a showpiece. Obviously, I don't believe him. I'm a big, strong fellow, but looking at the calculated weight of Durasteel he's given me, I'm thinking I would barely be able to stand up in that armor, let alone fight. It took him ages to convince me you were real. He sent me a scan of your body. I nano-forged a mannequin of you, and that was what finally made you real for me. I would know the body I spent 3 months forging for anywhere. I spotted you from all the way across the room. I must say, that armor is some of my finest work. Though, I've always been curious, why an open-face helmet? With an enclosed helmet, I would dare say you could survive a direct hit with an anti-tank gun in that suit. Thran mumbles something inaudible, causing the man to laugh. You'll have to speak up, I'm afraid. I know I've got ears like a troll, but they don't help me hear any better. Come to think of it, it's been a while since my last region. Might be going a bit deaf. Thran's olive skin flushes red as she says, I got claustrophobic. The closed helm Fabrizio had me try made me feel like I was wearing a coffin. Had a panic attack. Requested an open one. I know it's silly. No, girl, says the avuncular man, as if offended on her behalf. Armor that gives you a panic attack is armor you're not going to wear. If offered the choice between having someone wear 70% of one of my helmets or not wear 100% of one, I'd go with the former every time. It would break my heart to have put so much of myself into forging a paperweight. You made the right choice. Unconvinced, Thran responds, I should probably have just got the closed one and forced myself to get used to it, though. The Forge Master shrugs, and I should probably not eat so much cheese, given how horrendously gassy it makes me. Picking up a hunk of cheese from the table and taking an enormous bite of it, pausing to relish the curd for a moment, then winking, Nobody's perfect. Yasmin's perspective, I shit you not. A whole arse hand inside the scrapped armor the salvage crew brought me. Most of a forearm, too, the hybrid New Norseman says, speaking to the Neanderthal Tatar, the Chwani Datsu, and the Japanese woman, gesturing on his own thick right forearm to where the cutoff was. Most disgusting thing I've ever touched. Showed it to them, and they said that it wasn't their department. But if it hadn't been removed, then its original owner was still alive, so it wasn't considered remains. I told them, I don't give a fuck what it's considered. What do you want me to do with a whole arse human hand? You want to know their solution, he asks, not waiting for an answer. Why can't you just throw it in the furnace? Won't it just burn up? Here, the Chwani Thatkikin. Xu interjects with a question, with dozens of distinct clicks dancing around the interior of her mouth, but hers being that most precious of commodities, a language I don't yet speak. I'm left to infer that she asks something like, can't you do that? For the combination of her tone and the answer the stocky Norse speaker gives. No! Forging Durasteel takes precise conditions. A single human hand added to the mix would have the capacity to contaminate more than 14 tons of salvage. This is armor that has to let its wearer run headlong at a machine gun nest. It has to let our soldiers do what they do to win us the war. No bodging. Good enough isn't good enough. Forging Durasteel isn't exactly a technical feat, Hell. If we'd known what to do, we probably would have been able to forge it since the invention of artificial gravity in the 23rd century. But it's so finicky, so particular that if you don't already know what you're doing, well, it would take more trial and error than is possible for one lifetime to work it out from first principles. The fact that Terrans were the first to produce it, despite not being anywhere near the level of technical advancement as the rest of the galaxy, is probably because we were the only ones who would. Losing interest in that conversation, I turned my attention to the head table. I nudged the Norsewoman next to me, attracting her attention. "Excuse me, miss." By Allah. The thrill I get as her glittering sapphire eyes widen and flick to my left temple, then right, to confirm that no, I'm not wearing a translator, and yes, I did just speak to you in your natural language. This is what I live for. I was wondering if you could enlighten me? She hesitates a moment before stammering, what do you want to know?" I gestured to the table at the head of the room. "You see those 3 tall, blue-skinned non-Terrans sitting at your priestess's table. I was wondering if you could tell me everything you know about them." Looking uncertain, she answers, "Tun, Vol, and Bassa? You mean about their species, or about them as individuals?" I smile. "Both. As much as you know and are comfortable telling me," and take a sip of my tart apple juice, as she starts speaking. "So, their species is called the Don. There are about 300 or so on Fenoscandia. They're from a planet about 25 Li away that isn't part of the GU. It's an eyeball world. They historically hated outsiders, but one of the clans had an embassy here. From a few years after the war ended, when the first settlement started, to about 17 years ago, those 3's parents popped back home, and the only thing that came back was a message in untranslated Donavu, saying that any Don who has left Donalu is considered a traitor to their species, and will be dealt with as such, should they return, making the embassy into refugees. Externally, I make sympathetic noises, but internally, I'm greedily gobbling up the linguistic tidbits of this rare language, with delight it would be entirely inappropriate to express. It sounds like their language is big into compounding. Avu must mean language, but it's probably in a genitive form, right? So language of the Olu must mean planet of the, would you be a genitive case marker? I'll have to ask the one on the bright plume if she's willing to help me learn her people's tongue. If there are only a few hundred off their cradle world, I imagine there aren't enough resources for me to be able to teach myself. Turning my attention away from the juicy new potential addition to my collection, I ask, "So how come they're sitting with your priestess? Are they even pagans?" Tuni is," she gestures to the one I recognize. "Vol," she gestures at the grim-faced man with harsh, angular black lines tattooed across his face and hands and wearing princely clothing. He keeps to Donuvu, at least officially. His wife, Estreater, next to him. She gestures at the caramel blonde human sat beside him, with a matching set of tattoos. She's one of Priestess Thoradottir and Mrs. Arnadottir's natural children, but she converted for him. They wouldn't have been able to marry without being the same faith, I query. She shakes her head. They would have, but it would have meant Vol relinquishing his position as leader of the splinter of his clan here. They're very traditionalist. They rule by male primogeniture, which is why he inherited over Bassa, who's the oldest. But they wouldn't have accepted a leader who was married to someone not of the Danuvu faith, she says, tautologizing the word faith, by my guess. Bassa I don't know about. I've not heard her or anyone else talk about her religious views. I know she doesn't wear a cross or Mjolnir around her neck, but that doesn't mean anything. Neither of those faiths requires a pendant to be worn. From context, I can infer that those tattoos have nothing to do with Danuvu, or, at least, are not a requirement of it, since my conversation partner doesn't mention their absence from her. I would guess they're a mark of leadership. I'm going to have a lot of fun gossiping to Jay about this later. That Korean sociologist has some very interesting perspectives. I wonder, for instance, why the exiles would cling to the trappings of a culture that made them pariahs and exiles. And why are they at the head table, I ask, trying not to sound like I'm irritated that she forgot the other question, which I'm not. Oh, that's easy. Katrina and Heidi raised them. Tun was 6, Vol was, I want to say 10, and Bassa was, I think, 14 when their parents died, so they took them in. A mirthful grin spreads across my face as I ask, "You mean Vol married his stepsister?" The nervous Norsewoman shifts uncomfortably and answers, Yes, well, sort of. Technically, Tun was the only one who was legally their daughter. They were just guardians of the other two. I grin wider. More defensively, she says, they're not even the same species, let alone related by blood. It's not incest in any way. Still grinning, I respond, except emotionally. She gives an exasperated eye roll and answers, yes, well, when emotional incest starts causing birth defects, let me know. I laugh at that and answer, fair enough, you're right. It's not my business. Then I realize there's something I haven't asked. What's your name, by the way? Revna, she answers, back to her adorably shy stammer. I'm Yasmin. It's a pleasure, Revna. I smile. We shake hands. Jay's perspective. I watch from a few seats away as my new friend and dorm mate converses flirtatiously with a strikingly blue-eyed, raven-haired woman who's noticeably more drunk than she is. Not hard when her faith prohibits the consumption of alcohol and has no loopholes for fermentations of honey, whatever certain films might lead you to believe. Seeing the flush on the face of the pale-skinned stranger reminds me to check in on my own little drunkard. I turn to the skinny boy I've got my arm around and see the expression on his face. He's struggling slightly. It's understandable, he only started drinking very recently. How are you holding up, sweetie? I smile kindly. I'm okay, says Timmy. It's not as strong as your soju, but they've given me so much more of it. Timancha, I say, using my mother voice, if you're not enjoying drinking it, you should stop. Nobody's going to be offended. He shakes his head. It's fine, Moo. Jay, he corrects himself. Seeing how my eyes widen at the word he was about to say, it's fine. I can finish this horn and then I just won't have any more. Living the lifestyle of a hunter-gatherer his entire life until recently has made this boy abhor waste. It's cute, sort of, though it does make me think of a friend from uni who once told me parents may hate picky eaters, but social workers love them, then explained that a picky eater was one who had never been starved for days on end, past the point where hunger feels physically painful, to the point where it becomes a numb, all-consuming absence. In short, a picky child is one who's been loved and well taken care of their whole life. I think about arguing the point further, but decide to just let him be and give him a reassuring squeeze, saying, all right then, young man, your last one. I'll hold you to that. He blushes and I smile. Letting him get on with the business of nursing his drinking horn, I look around at the room we're in. Everything here is Frankenstein culture, a term used for societies that have at one point or another entirely died out and had no active participants. The Norse faith had no practitioners for centuries during the second millennium. The Norse language evolved into Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, only staying partly intelligible to its prior form in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Of course, elements of the culture survived and got incorporated into the successor cultures, like Christmas, for instance. But the culture was functionally extinct from the 11th to the 19th centuries. Even after its revival, though, it stayed with only a few thousand people, until a sudden explosion of popularity in the 22nd century brought it to once again being more than a fringe phenomenon. Today, the Norse faith has nearly 2 billion practitioners, and the New Norse language has several times that many. Difficult to say definitively, though, since it's close enough to Icelandic and Faroese that they readily swap vocab and have only a little trouble register shifting to be able to converse. However, the fact that it's spent hundreds of years extinct means that there's a lot that simply can't be reconstructed. Those people singing a song with rhythmic guttural chants are singing a combination of what early third millennials thought Viking music would have sounded like, and musical techniques borrowed from other cultures. That man backing the song with throat singing, if I correctly recall my sociology seminars, is using a style originally borrowed from the Mongolic peoples of Central Asia. Those people over there, who've set up a ring on the floor and are boisterously trying to push one another out of it, are effectively just sumo wrestling. We have no way of knowing what old Norse songs sounded like, and only vague references from the sagas and Eddas for what their contests of strength were like. Regardless, everything around me feels genuine, not like a hollow recreation of a culture that lived long ago, but like a culture that is truly alive now, today. I'm just looking at the head table when I notice that several of the seats, including Katrine's and Heidi's, have been empty for a while. When the room is plunged into darkness and total silence falls, broken only by a few people shushing those that need to be shushed. There's some shuffling I hear from the head of the room and to the left when I face that way, which moves into the center. The spotlight shines on a standing tune. Long ago, in the halls of Valhall, Thor, son of Odin and the mightiest of all the gods, whose hammer, Mjolnir, both defended Asgard and was thrown each spring to break the sea ice that had formed in the winter, lay sleeping beside his wife, the fair lady Sif. Wedding, Scylla's perspective. The lights dim, the only parts of the room still being lit brightly enough that I think a human would consider them visible, being those immediately around their fireplaces. I adjust my seating position, shifting slightly to bring my front legs forward, away from the bench, and my back legs towards it. One of the glowing-eyed species at the head table stands. Tun. She's from the Bright Plume. The one who seems to be the queen of this community emerges from a side door, followed by her wife and a few others, dressed in strange garb. All, except the single non-human in the group, holding their holopads to their eyes to compensate for their dearth of dark vision and allow them to see where they're going. The Terrans navigate themselves to points that they seem to have agreed ahead of time. The enormous blonde queen is wearing a fulsome fake beard. It's rather amusing a thing to see on a human woman's face, having become accustomed to only seeing them on the faces of their men. Her outfit is a collage of reflective and silvered materials. Its construction, like her beard, is more similar to those being worn by her male countrymen, suggesting that it codes masculinity, that the character she plays is meant to be a man. She carries a short-handled hammer, the head of which is so large that it must be hollow. Not even a human could wield that. It's engraved with jagged lines that I'm not sure the significance of. She lies down next to a woman who is not her wife and places the impossible hammer beside herself. A bright spotlight illuminates Tun, who speaks, Krisha's perspective. We're sat by the fire, and Hasi has her entire body wrapped around me in a way that would definitely be inappropriate for public if she were warm-blooded. As it stands, I've only noticed a few eyebrows raised in amusement. I'm just admiring the flavors they've managed to bring out in the meat dish I'm sharing with her, wondering whether I should ask after the cook so we can swap notes. When the lights go out, I look into Hasi's face, visible by the light of the fire, and we share a bemused expression for a few moments. Then a spotlight shines on Tun. She's standing and speaks loudly. I don't think I've ever heard her project her voice like this. She's usually so nervous and timid. It's sort of hard to reconcile her having such a bold job title as Auxiliary Security Officer. For this Tun, who's just started telling the story I presume must be Thor's wedding, it's completely believable that that would be her job. Steve's perspective. That harumphing Great Sheila's on the ground, wearing a fake red beard that doesn't match her blonde hair. The beard suits her surprisingly well. She's almost a handsome enough woman to make me forget which cricket team I bat for. Almost. There's another much smaller blonde on one side of her and a whacking great hammer on the other. I guess that makes her Thor then? I don't know much about Viking myths, but I'm pretty sure the guy with the hammer is Thor. He's Fair Lady Sif. But there was wickedness afoot. For while Thor slept, someone crept beside him and took the hammer. Mjolnir, says the Sheila with 4 arms, in the spotlight at the head table. Yep, Lady in the Beard's definitely meant to be Thor. A furry paw hand, that I'm guessing is attached to that grizzly bear uplift I saw earlier, comes from outside the spotlight, illuminating the 2 women, and nicks the hammer with those lightning lines all over it. When Thor, the tumultuous, awoke, he reached for his hammer and found it not, says the blue lady, matched by the big one, waking up, immediately putting her hand where the hammer was, freezing, then panicking. The titchy blonde playing her wife shrieks as she's rolled off the sheets by the giant woman, looking for her hammer. There was only one person mighty Thor could think that might have done such a thing as steal Mjolnir. The woman in the fake beard huffs, acting like her rage is building for a few seconds, before thundering at the top of her lungs, Loki! Mazia's perspective. A second spotlight illuminates Tun's other mother, between the tables, miming calm conversation with a supporting actor. Unlike Katrine, whose outfit seems to be an original creation, in rich reflective silvers and blues, with a noticeable lightning motif, Heidi's outfit seems to have been lifted wholesale from the design of Loki's clothing in a certain early 21st century cinematic universe, all greens and blacks and complete with a golden helmet, bearing 2 tall, backward curved horns. Loki! Booms the enormous woman again, causing both of the other actors to whip their heads in her direction. Looks of fear play across their faces, and the minor character immediately ducks out of the spotlight. I feel Fliss shake with giggles beneath my arm, and I give her a little squeeze. Doing a fantastic job of acting like she's absolutely terrified, but trying not to show it, the dark-haired woman nervously smiles. Nephew, to what do I owe? Spare me, backbiter! Where is it? The golden-haired woman interrupts, bellowing, teeth bared furiously. Where is what, dear nephew? Says the smaller woman with alarm, backing hurriedly away from her quickly advancing wife. My hammer, Loki! Where have you hidden it? Mjolnir's gone? Asks the woman with the golden horns, immediately followed by her wife, grasping her lapels and lifting her bodily overhead, such that her feet dangle nearly a meter off the ground. Her face is terrified, her wife's is furious. Do not lie to me, Loki! I know you took it! Without that hammer, I cannot defend Asgardr. Your jest has gone too far this time. Nephew, I swear to you, I did not take your hammer, insists Heidi's Loki. There isn't even a flicker of doubt on the face of Katrine's Thor as she says, Tell me, Loki, why is Mjolnir's handle so short? Downcast, the smaller woman answers, That would be because I transformed myself into a gadfly and bothered the one working the bellows until he swatted at me, ruining some of the iron. And remind me, why did you want to ruin their craft? Says the large woman, turning her head as if to hear better. Sigh. Because I'd made a bet with them that they couldn't forge 3 treasures to exceed the 3 that the sons of Ivaldi had made me, a bet which I lost, and got my mouth sewn shut, and almost lost me my head. Nodding and feigning consideration, the giant woman asks, Interesting. And could you just tell me, why did you originally go to the sons of Ivaldi? See... Because I cut off your wife's hair while she was sleeping, and then promised I'd procure a replacement. If you promise not to break every bone in my body, she answers defeatedly. So tell me, why exactly? Should I believe that this wasn't you? The smaller woman looks down into the eyes of the one holding her aloft, and thinks for a few moments before querying, Have I ever failed to take credit for well-done mischief, nephew? The large woman frowns, then scowls, then disgustedly drops her wife. If it wasn't you, backbiter, then find me who it was. Tune narrates again. The unlikely pair made their way to the halls of Freya to request that she lend them her feathered mantle, Fjadramr. Had it been Loki alone, the Vanir goddess never would have trusted him with such a treasure. But, with Thor vouching for him, she agreed. The two women suddenly share the spotlight with a third, this one dressed as a woman, who has hair the color of common milkwort flowers. This new woman holds out a feathery cloth, which Heidi takes and throws around her shoulders, before walking away from the other two, the spotlight following her and leaving them behind. Flew then Loki, shrouded in Fjadramr, beyond the halls and lands of the gods, to the home of the Jotnar, continues Tune. He found Thrymr, the Jotun king, sat surrounded by wealth. The light encompasses an Ursus sapiens, clad in gray clothes and black armor, with a black crown atop his head. He's definitely my type, or would be if I weren't a happily engaged man. The man, who I think must be one of the few people in the room who's larger than her wife, looks down at the gold-horned woman and leers. Greeting, Loki, Laufey's son. How goes it with the gods? How goes it with the elves? Why have you come alone into Jotunheimr? Brunhilde's perspective. I knew this story before tonight. One of my father's crew was a Norse pantheonist and, unlike my father, seemed sincere in his faith, and not like he was using it as a license to behave however he damn well pleased. However, when Gunnar told this story, he never made it so funny. In fairness, he didn't have an acting cast supporting him, but still. I watched the violet-haired woman snarl and scowl in response to having been told by Tune's mums, after they were done returning her feather cloak, that she's to accompany them to Jotunheim to be Thrym's bride, so that Thor can get his hammer back. You must think me a lustful woman of loose virtue, mad for any man, if you would ask me to go with you to be a Jotun's wife, snarls the woman. She's definitely stunning enough to be the goddess of beauty and fertility. Tune's mums shrink and cower before the wrath of a woman who's much smaller than either of them. It's a hilarious sight. The answer is no, shouts the small woman, miming slamming a door, coupled with a sound effect of the same. Tune narrates, Thrymr had assuredly never met Freya for, if he had, he would have known that, while she is the most beautiful of all the goddesses, she is also the most tempestuous, with a temper to match that of Thor. Their plan refused, Thor and Loki called a grand council of all the gods and goddesses of Asgardr. A circle of actors, portraying the gods, gathers into the spotlight. The only one I recognize is the one wearing an eye patch and done up in old man makeup playing Odin. They argued long and hard about what was to be done until the wise Vanir, Heimdallr, fairest of the gods, stood and said, If Thrymr wants a bride, I say we give him one, announces a man in the spotlight, who, I'm guessing, passes for good-looking, to the male attracted. He smirks at Thor as he says, If we dress you in bridal linens, give you Freya's torque, Brisingamen, hang the customary keys at your belt, daintily drape a veil over your face, and perhaps build your chest up with stones. The woman with the red beard looks as if she's just watched someone murder a puppy, as she says I shall be called womanly by all the gods if I let myself be draped in a bridal veil, with disgust. There's a chuckle that goes around the room at this woman playing a man so horrified at the notion of playing a woman. Her wife slaps her face and says, Silence yourself, Thor. If you do not recover your hammer, the Jotnar shall presently overrun Asgardr. If that is not what you wish, then this is the plan. Sternly, the enormous woman frowns for a few moments before answering with a simple nod. The smaller woman nods as well and then smirks. With my shapeshifting, I shall transform into your maidservant, and we two shall go to Jotunheimer. Gunnar explained to me that there is an untranslatable joke in that line. Loki uses the same gender-neutral word for two as Thor did about himself and Freya, as one would for a man and a woman, not the masculine, for two men, not the feminine, for two women. The joke is the implied question. Which of them is he saying is the woman? Himself, the gender-fluid, transforming trickster who has actually been a mother before? Or Thor, the most masculine god there is, currently wearing a dress? Shi Dao Yuan's perspective, the giant Norse martial artist, who's older than even me, if the UTCM CQC that shines through in her bearing is anything to go by, is wrapped in clothing that I infer to be a bridal gown in this culture. A torque is put around her neck, and keys are hung at her hip. Her face is covered with a veil, which has obviously been designed to leave just a sliver of red beard visible at the bottom. It is extremely amusing to see how well she pretends to have nothing but distaste for these trappings. As a person who's been certain, since his early teens, that he would never be attracted to anyone, of any gender, the fastidious care that others take over their gender constructions has always been a source of great amusement to me. As they walk, the enormous one turns to talk to the one I'm having trouble not thinking of as the small one, given how she's the same height as I am, just because of how much she is put into forced perspective by being beside her wife. If you can shapeshift, why are you not the one playing Freya? She asks, a frown in her voice, but her face not visible through her veil. Wavers the average-sized woman, with her feminine features and dress being newly restored to visibility, to represent her having shapeshifted into a maidservant. Oh, look, we're here and they see us. Too late now, she says innocently, pointing at the black armored bear, zero combat experience, eliciting a laugh from the entire hall. Stand, my Jotnar. They send me Freya, Njordr's daughter, as wife, he says gleefully. A small crowd of bit players stand around the towering bearman. Tootie Toon continues her narration, making excellent use of the breathing techniques I taught her recently. The Jotnar threw a great feast that night, in honor of the marriage of their king to the goddess Freya. The woman disappears behind a screen, and her shadow is projected on the wall, large enough for the entire hall to easily see. They brought forth 3 tons of mead, announces my Tootie, as her mother picks up something that makes a barrel-shaped shadow and brings it to her mouth, making exaggerated glugging sounds, a process she repeats 2 more times. They brought forth 8 salmon. The silhouetted woman picks up a fish-shaped shadow and brings it to her mouth, making exaggerated eating noises, a process she repeats 7 more times. They brought forth many womanly dainties, more mimed eating of indistinct shapes, and they brought forth a whole roasted ox. For this I am certain the shadow is made entirely in the light, and there is no physical ox as present as the shadow, far bigger than the woman, disappears into her mouth. Sif's man ate them all. The bearman turns to the mother of my student, who has remained visible, and uncertainly says, I've never seen a bride eat quite as much as this, nor drink this much. The wily handmaiden just smiled, says my Tootie. Her mother, not doing the voice of a man pretending to be a woman, rather simply speaking in her normal feminine voice, smiles. The Lady Freya has eaten nothing these past 8 nights. So eager was she to come to Jotunheimer, to be your wife, my lord. Excited by this, the Jotun king desired to kiss his bride. Toon narrates, matched by the peaceable bear grinning stupidly and disappearing behind the screen, his shadow joining the elderly soldiers. Bearing down, he lifts the veil and shrieks, turning to flee. Her eyes, they were red, like fire. I thought they would burn me, says the Ursid, playing at being out of breath. The wily handmaiden just smiled. The Lady Freya has not slept these past 8 nights. So eager was she to come to Jotunheimer to be your wife, my lord. The Ursine man gives another foolish smile. My student narrates, then came the king's sister, who had the job of asking what bridal gift was desired. A human woman appears. I suppose there wasn't another Ursus to play the sister. The king booms, bring in the hammer of Thor and lay it across the maiden's knees that Var may bless our union. In Kasyogi's perspective, Toon's doing really well with the narration. I really wish Amy and Lou were here to see this. I'll have to describe it to them next call. It would be a breathtaking, once-in-a-lifetime experience to share with them. Maybe I could suggest an extended vacation and a holiday to Nova Fenascandia when I get back. Sigh in 2 years. Thrimmer's sister went to do as he bade and fetched the hammer, narrates Toon. The small woman goes and comes back with the hammer we saw earlier. She goes behind that screen and puts it on the knees of Tun's mum's shadow. The woman starts laughing, the slow, building laugh of a maniac. She picks up her hammer and reemerges from the shadows. She rips off the veil and runs at the bear man. Still laughing, she bashes him in the chest so hard that it's audible even from here and without any amplification. He goes down, followed by the leading lady miming strikes on all the bit players of his court. Thus were Thor and his hammer reunited. A raucous cheer is raised, with the various Norsemen and women pounding the tables rather than clapping their hands. I follow their lead. To Kekkel's perspective. It's been a while since the play ended and talk resumed. I watch from the perch, which apparently used to belong to pet ravens, behind Mrs. Thoradottir's throne, as Mrs. Arnadottir has an animated conversation with Jenny. So you didn't object to having an epithet that clashed with your religion? Asks the small, curly-haired woman. The dark-haired one answers, No, not at all. It's barely caused any problem since. Occasionally someone will get confused, that's all. Well, that's good then. It'd be terrible to have an epithet you hate. Like Tun. I don't hate Elf. Tun objects. I'm just ambivalent about it. It doesn't really feel like my name, you know? Yes, that's right. I think she'd much rather have had her classmates call her Neytiri, smiles Tun's mother, causing both Tun and Jenny to freeze, and Victor and Brunhilde to look over curiously. Neytiri, asks Jenny, an unnerving grin spreading across her face. Oh, yes. She went through a years-long phase where she was massively obsessed with the centuries-old media franchise, with aliens that rather look like Don. Oh, it was so adorable. Anytime anyone annoyed her in that phase, they were a skzong. She dyed her hair dark like them, dived deep into the research too. I remember her talking my ear off about why the Na'vi were tetrapods, despite the fact that all other vertebrate life on their planet were hexapods, like Don R. Mom? Says Tun, her mortified embarrassment visible even to me. What, Toonie? Smiles her mother sweetly. That's so embarrassing, she says, eyes wide and cheeks purple. More smiling. I'm your mother, sweetheart. Embarrassing you is my job. Tun huffs. I was well over my avatar phase before I went to uni. We're never fully over the things we obsess about, Toonie. We may think we're done with them, but they've changed us, made us different people than we would otherwise be. That's rather philosophical, I interject. Thank you, smiles back Arnadottir. Victor, I say, addressing the man. Yeah, Cap, he answers distractedly. Explain to me again what this story you're about to recite is. Beowulf, Cap. It's an epic, written in Old English. Kinda wish I didn't have to follow the play that we just had. Nonsense, boy, booms Thoradottir, hoarse from ministering her congregation. We love a good story regardless of when it's told. Beowulf's just far enough outside of our regular wheelhouse that the younger folk here might not know it. Thanks, Katrine. He smiles nervously. You say Old English? Is that like the Shakespearean works we've watched together? I ask, remembering how confusing it was to have explained to me that the informal pronouns thou, thee, thy, and thine are often mistaken for formal by modern speakers because of the prestige that Terrans assign to age. He shakes his head. Older than that, Cap, though I'm a bit ashamed to say the only reason I speak it at all is because I thought learning it'd be a doddle when I chose it at school. It definitely weren't. Surely, since it has English in the name, he laughs. It's like having a conversation with my 8-year-old self. Tell you what, Cap, I'm going to start soon. When I do, turn off your translator. See how much you get with only your knowledge of modern English. All you'll miss for the first minute or two is the fact that the story's being told by someone who self-describes as a spear Dane, and that there was once this amazing king called Scyld Scefing, who kicked a lot of arse and didn't have time to take a lot of names, because of how much tribute he was collecting from folk who didn't want their arses kicked. All right, Victor, I will try to listen to your story with my translator turned off at first, I say curiously. Speaking of, says Thoradottir, gesturing to her wrist in the inexplicable way that Terrans do to make each other aware of time. Oh shit, yeah, I should probably start. He stands, and unlike Tun, who narrated from her spot at the table, he makes his way to the open performance space. The lights dim rather than extinguishing as the spotlight falls upon him. I turn off my translator. He raises his hand and cries, What? All right. That didn't sound like any English I've ever heard, but it was a pretty clear hark. Listen, shut up, I have a story to tell. I'm beginning to wonder if I might be able to infer the meaning of the entire story that way, when he dashes that hope, We Gardena in Girdagum, Theod Sininga Thrim Gefrunon, Huda Aethalingus Ellen Fremedon, Oft, Scyld Sefing, Skethena Threatum, Monagum, Magthum, Miodosetla, Ovthea, Exode Eorles, Sieden erst werd feesjaft funden, Hethes frofre gebad, activating translation. Waxing under the heavens, in honor he thrived, until such time as unto him all the tribes across the whale road submitted and yielded tribute. That was a good king. That language has no business being called English. Later, the feast is wound down and the congregation have departed, including the bright plumers, aside from myself and the triple M's, who have been invited to stay. Victor's story seemed to go down well. It seems that his worry about following a better story was unfounded. Korak is already roosting with our child. I'm just admiring a photo that Toon's mothers have displayed. I hear loud footsteps and swivel my head to see one of Toon's mothers approaching. Mrs. Thoradottir, I just wanted to thank you for your hospitality and congratulate you on an extremely entertaining party. She smiles and answers, You're welcome and thank you. I point to the towering, blonde-bearded soldier in the photo I was admiring and ask, Is this Thorkel Thorson here, your brother, Mrs. Thoradottir? She leans in and puffs through her nose. Yes, a brother long since departed for Valhall. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. She smiles. Don't be. Ancient history. Also, well done for seeing through the patronymic. That throws off most Terrans if they aren't used to it. I preen. Well, Mrs. McLeod has explained to me recently how she used to be Nicleoid. But most people who don't speak Gaelic are much more familiar with the masculine mackerel than the feminine Nick, Ake, so she changed it after university. I was rather primed to notice them. She shrugs. Still impressive. Truth be told, the first thing I noticed was how closely you and your brother resemble each other. Only afterward did I notice the name. If you weren't the opposite sex from each other, I'd say you were the same person. She laughs. All right, you should probably go to bed now. We've got another busy day tomorrow.